Welcome back to week 4 of vry102. I'm Darius Derkshani. I will be your cruise director for this class. Let's get right to it. So here is a scene, plain V-Ray scene VO4. This is what we ended up with last week at the end of week 3. We have GI turned on with the default irradiance map and brute force. Towards the end of today's class, we'll go in and start comparing some of these engines and how to mitigate the noise from them. But this is the render we're pretty much getting with the GI turned on. Everything's looking pretty nice. And what I'm going to start with is the geometry that we have for these candles is a little ridiculous. Meaning, this bottom of the candle jar has 41,000 faces. The top has an additional 72,000 faces. The little rubber stopper has about 143,000 faces. It's a lot of faces. A lot of faces for these. And there's a reason why I brought these in at such a high tessellation is for the smoothness. These render out really, really nicely and really smoothly, especially around these detailed areas. But do you really need that kind of tessellation? So what I've got prepared are a pair of low-res candles. These high-res candles have turned our scene files into 96 meg files, which again, it's kind of obnoxious. But we're going to go ahead and bring in the low-res versions that you downloaded in the week 3 files. The Maya as well as the Max versions have a file called candles import low poly. Obviously the .ma for the Maya, the .max for the Max, but we'll come back and do the Max thing at the end of this video when we redo some of these things in 3ds Max. So, well, anyway, we're going to want to import this. And at 7 megs, it's going to be much, much better than the ridiculously high tessellation and file size we're getting from these guys. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the outliner, and we're going to take these two candle groups, and I'm going to hide them for right now. Mostly because we want to be able to get the right shaders. I don't want to get rid of that stuff yet because we have to transfer the information over to the low poly ones. And then we'll take a look at how they render and how we can get them to render nicer. So let's go ahead and Control H to hide these guys. And then simply I'm going to click and drag my MA file right into the scene, and here we go. We have much lower tessellation for these objects, but obviously they don't have their shaders assigned. We have to copy them back over from here. Now this is where naming your shaders is super duper handy. And here they all are named. This will be in the V-Ray Scene 4 file from this week's downloads, or hopefully you have something similar to this in your own file from last week, and everything's named to make it obviously easier. Now there's some MIA shaders in here, and that's from the low-res candles that have come in. So we're going to select all of the glass for the old candles, or I should say the low-res candles, and attach them to candle glass jar material. And we'll go down the line. There's the wax we can see for the candles, and that'll go on the candle material. We've got the wick. You can see here there are the wicks, and there's a candle wick material. And last but not least is the plastic sealer, and we have that right there. So we have our candles all assigned for the new ones. If I go to Edit Unused Nodes, my MIA shaders will pop out. And there we go. Now, I'm in the legacy renderer for the viewport. You may be in viewport 2.0. So if I press 6, my glass seems to disappear, but it is still there, obviously. And I'm just going to go ahead and save because I'm paranoid, and we'll move forward. Now, going into rendering the lower res glass, here's our current render with the high res glass, and having rendered this lower res glass gives us, a little bit of a difference. Most noticeably, the candle wax is interpenetrating the glass on the inside. The two tessellations are different. So there's a little bit of penetration going on there. That's one. Number two, between these two, is the high res, we've lost some definition, particularly around this really nice, more dense part of the glass in the high res is sort of lost. So this is looking a little bit more thin. Now, the poly count is a lot better. However, it does leave some to be desired. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up this object to subdivide at render time. So in the object, I'm going to go into the attribute editor, and I'm going to add subdivision and displacement quality. Now, we've seen what subdivision and displacement quality does in a previous class. That gives us the familiar max subdivs and edge length, but subdivision that I've added allows us to render this object as a subdivision surface, looking at the max subdivs as the maximum amount that it will subdivide. Now, if I go in and I render our foremost candle, we'll be able to see this subdivide a little bit more, and hopefully we can get rid of some of that interpenetration. As we start to render, you can see that interpenetration is pretty much gone. There's still a little bit up around here at the top. This is with a max subdivs of 4. And now that it's finished, we'll take a look at the render history and see the difference between these. So you can tell there's been quite a lot of improvement, especially with the interpenetration with the candle wax, but also our angles seem to have smoothed out. Now, we don't get anywhere near the detail that we had with the higher resolution. Of course, having the geometry is the absolute best way to preserve the integrity of your detail, but this certainly does a much better job taking that low res and giving you a better result. Now, we're at a max subdiv of 4. If you go to 16 or 24, maybe even 32, you should start noticing that the interpenetration issues will go away. Now, the thing is, you have to add these two attributes to all of the object shape nodes. So, for example, on the lid, I'm going to need to go in and add the subdivision and subdivision display quality. You won't be able to go into the node for the group to add that. It has to be on the shape node itself. Again, it won't go on this node. It has to be on the shape node. And I'll be adding it to the lid as well as to the little plastic stopper for my candle. I don't need it for the candle wax itself. It's pretty well subdivided already. Same thing in the wick. It really doesn't need it. It's more so the lid, the sealer, and the glass jar itself. And I want them all to have the same subdivision number. Now, I've already gone ahead and added it to the other candle objects here. So that's already in place for us. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this glass jar my master controller. So whatever number is my max subdivs for my glass jar, I want it to echo through the other parts, because all the other parts will come in with a max subdiv default of 4. Now I could go in and manually change each one to 32, but if I'm experimenting, and I often will be to try to find the lowest max subdiv number I can to get a good result, I'm going to want all of those parts to have the same max. So to do that, I need to make sure that all of these objects have discrete names. And because I've got 2 of these glass jars, each shape node has a similar name to it. Even though the parent node is named differently, I'm going to want to change these guys to be unique names. So I'm going to add an A, don't need that, to the ends of all of my shape nodes. I'll go ahead and add it here anyway, what the heck. And then I'll be adding a B to these, so I know that these are all unique names. You can do that with the groups as well if I want, but this will work out just fine. So I'm going to go into the glass jar, into the shape. You see glass jar A shape. And under the vray attributes, when I right click, I'm going to click on create new expression. And what this is going to give me is the syntax name for that object's attribute. I'm going to copy that by hitting Control C. So I have this. I'll get rid of that window. I don't really need it. And I can go into the glass lid. And under the max subdiv, all I need to do is type in equals and then paste the name that I just copied. And you see it turns purple, which denotes that there's an expression. We can edit that expression. We'll see that it connects the subdivs for the lid to the subdivs for the jar shape. And that, again, is what we copied into our clipboard. So I'll go into the plastic sealer. I'll do the same thing, equals, paste, and there we go. We can do the same for the B jar, equals, paste that name from the A jar, the lid, equals, paste the name from the A jar, and finally the sealer, equals, paste the name from the A jar. Now, whatever I change on my master, and I'll have to remember that this is my master, it will reflect in all the other objects. See, we have 64 across the board. So while you're playing around and trying to find the best number, you can connect them all with expressions very quickly and easily. Now I can go ahead and delete my large tessellated candles and save my scene, and it'll be quite a bit smaller. We've gone from about 100 megs to about 13. So we're saving quite a bit of space, but again, we're losing a little tiny bit of our geometry detail with the high-res glass versus the low-res glass. Now, here we are with a close-up on just the lid. I've turned the airplane off to get it out of the way. What we're looking at is a render of the jar lid, and we want to take a quick look at caustics. By default, refractive caustics are on. When I go ahead and turn reflective caustics on, I should get a little bit more of an illumination reflecting off of the glass here. With this on, I went ahead and will render this region. And this is our result. If we take a look at the difference between the two, we see that there's more illumination. specifically coming off of the reflections of the jar here. Now, you may be saying, well, that's not a whole lot. I mean, it's just a whole bunch of little dots. This is where some of the noise comes in to play. So here we are with the current render settings. We've got a min and a max of 1 and 5 respectively, with a threshold of 0.01 for the global image sampler. What's going on is the kind of noise that you see, the little fine grain, the dots, this sort of grain noise that you can see on the table back here, this is all sampling noise. Subdivs will take care of that. As we saw in week 2's class, we want to lower our threshold. So for a much cleaner render, especially when you've got the reflective caustics giving you this sort of chatter, we're going to turn things way up. We've got a low threshold, which really helps when you've got single color or similar color, similar tonal range. This sort of area gets cleaned up with a lower threshold better. But the combination of also turning up max subdivs gives us this render. As you can see, that's a much cleaner, much nicer render with a little bit of that caustic from the reflection coming off. And that was because we turned on this, and also because we've increased our max subdivs and our threshold as well. So we've got a cleaner render here, but we've got a much larger render time. Now we're reflecting, we're refracting, we've got GI on, so there's a lot going on for this scene to calculate. Your tolerance for noise really comes down to the quality of your renders and what features you have turned on, such as the reflective caustics. Now, let's turn everything back down so we're not looking at terribly high frames, but let's go to 1 and 8, and we'll do a more conservative threshold of 0.00, let's say 9. And we're really going to see a much better caustic result if we go in and add lights directly to what we want to reflect that caustic. Now, I have positioned a couple of lights here in front of and behind our little lid. And I'll go to my bookmark here. And I've gone ahead and rendered. Here's the full render with refractive and reflective caustics off. Now turning reflective caustics off, you get a little bit of a difference, namely in overall illumination plus a little bit of that This gives us about a minute and a half savings for that little bit, you can see. Now turning refractive caustics off gives us the biggest difference, because refractive caustics is what is responsible for lighting that translucency in that rubber stopper. And it's got a little bit of a time hit, about a minute and 10, minute 20 difference. With both reflective and refractive, you're looking at about a difference of about 3 minutes for those extra details. So it's really up to you how much of that detail you're looking for, but the refractive caustics is really where you get that rubber stopper coming through. Although it doesn't look bad here, it certainly does look a little nicer when it can refract. Okay, let's talk about noise a little bit here. We have a half HD render of our scene here from our original camera view. And our settings are GI is irradiance map and brute force. We have a preset of high for the irradiance map, and the brute force for the secondary engine is set to its default of 8 subdivs. So this is all default for the GI. And our regular sampling noise is set pretty well, a 1 and an 8 with a 0.009 threshold. Now, let's first take a look at the GI noise. You may see a little bit of splotchiness happening on this great big gray wall behind us with the warm yellows and the cool grays. If the compression on the video when you're watching this through FXPHD may make this a little bit difficult to watch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the controls, the effects controls for color correction, which is this icon in the lower left hand. And I've got color corrections here. I'm going to turn on let's start with levels. You can turn on levels, and I can start dragging around levels to see slightly different portions. And as I bring the blacks up, you can see that really coming into play. I'm going to turn the levels off, and I'll have a little bit better control with curves. I'm going to grab the end of my curve and shove it over to the right a little bit, and you can really start seeing the contrast in the splotchiness here. So hopefully this is something you can see with the compressed video online. There you go. So this noise, the larger blotchy noise, that's almost always as a result of a GI noise. More so irradiance map, possibly even light cache will cause that splotchy type of noise. The fine grain noise that you see is sampling noise, and that's mostly controlled through the min-max subdivs as well as the threshold. Of course, we've really crushed this, so a lot of that noise is coming forward a lot more. So if I go back to GI, let's try to get rid of that splotchiness even with this crushed color correction. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to set my preset to very high. And the settings don't really change even in the advanced section. What it essentially does is it adds another prepass during the render, which refines the calculation. When we take a look at a render, and I went ahead and rendered this section again, you can see that splotchiness really goes away. That extra prepass really helped out get rid of that splotchy noise. Where that splotchiness is really going to be distracting is with animation. This splotchiness is going to start swimming all over your scene. There are various presets in with the irradiance map. For example, high animation will try to mitigate some of that movement. Some of the other controls you have, aside from just the preset, is through subdivs and interpolation samples. The higher the interpolation samples, the more it will try to blend these splotches together. However, the higher the interpolation, typically, the less detail or the less finer detail you'll be able to get. You'll lose accuracy in that fine detail. Subdivisions will help alleviate that because it's casting basically more of these splotches into your scene. Be careful with these because they will increase your render times quite a bit. But just based on going from a high to a very high on the preset alone, we were able to get rid of the splotchiness. Now, keeping the very high preset, we're going to turn our attention to this fine grain noise. If we go back to our color corrections and turn off our curve corrections, the noise at our proper view is pretty good. It's not bad at all, and this is pretty acceptable for most things. Some of that grain may start looking like a film grain, may start moving around a little bit and be not terribly distracting. We're going to accentuate that again by turning our curves back on. You can see that. And that is really directly controlled by your threshold and your min and max subdivisions. That's pretty much all there is to noise quality as far as V-Ray goes. It's all about the subdivisions. Now, with a great big swatch of a very similar color, I'm going to get more mileage from reducing my overall threshold. So if I go down to something like 0.004, I'm going to get a lot cleaner of that grain noise. As a matter of fact, we'll go ahead and render this region and take a look. The only thing being different is my threshold changing. And of course, we see our prepass for the irradiance map is 5. We have 5 prepasses now, where with just the high preset, we would have 4. Give you an example, when we go to low or very low, you're going to get only a couple of prepasses. And here we see with our color correction that the noise is greatly mitigated between the two. I hope you can see the difference in the video. With the compression, it may be tough to see in the video, but overall you've gotten a cleaner look, especially if we turn off our curve here. You're going to notice that a little bit less so, but we didn't turn up our min or max divisions. We just turned down our threshold, forcing the sampling to go to the 8 maximum subdivisions earlier than usual. We can continue raising our subdivisions to get that even cleaner, but you're going to start burning your time. The render time, 3 minutes 40 seconds for the higher threshold, and half the threshold gave us about a 30-second increase for just this area. So that's really about it for the noise in these renders. It's really all about how you govern your threshold, most importantly. I'm going to set this back to the default of 0.01, and we'll go back to 1 and 5, and you'll clearly start seeing a lot more noise when we render this part out again. And here we go. We can turn our curves back on in a second to illustrate how much extra noise there is. You can barely see it here, but once we crush the contrast, really start to see more of a difference with that noise. So you have to basically go in and test what your tolerance is for this kind of noise. This sort of grain shows up mostly when you've got a similar color in a wide area. This sort of noise you won't notice as much in these areas because there's a lot of difference in the colors between pixels and total range. So grain really shows up mostly in this sort of area. Now let's compare some of our GI settings. I've set us back to 1.5 with a threshold of 0.01. I'm going to. We've already seen a radiance map and brute force, primary, secondary. With a high gives you this, and that's what we're going to go with. I'm going to go ahead and take these out of the history. So this is our current number 1. Now, the most accurate GI you're going to get is brute force, brute force. This does the best calculation for the illumination of what you're going to get. There is no pre-pass, and all of the noise, if any, that you get will be that fine grain noise. You won't get this splotchy stuff that you would with a map or a cache-based system. And as you can see, we're getting lots of little tiny yellow grains from our lighting, and this is because our primary bounce for the brute force is pretty noisy. And brute force for both engines ends up taking the longest out of any of the engine combinations. Using a radiance map and brute force is probably the most efficient as far as time versus quality goes. My personal favorite is brute force for the primary and light cache for the secondary. We'll take a look at that once this is done and we take a look at mitigating some of this noise. And here we can see the brute force noise looks like the grain. And brute force has its own subdivs setting as well. If you notice that the grain is happening more for your bounce for the brute force, it's generally better to go ahead and address these subdivs a little bit. We'll see what going from 8 to 16 does in just a swatch of this area. Now this was a 5.5 minute render, so brute force is longer for sure. Now let's go ahead and render this swatch at a 16. You already see in the buckets that are completed that the grain is definitely much better than before. It's not quite as sharp. It's still a little bit grainy, but going to 16 definitely helped it without having the overall subdivs go up any higher. Now, I went ahead and I brought our threshold way down and our min and max subdivs, and between the render noise, the brute force subdivs from before, when we were at a threshold of 0.01, there's really no change. Let's take this up a little bit to 16, and we'll see if the general subdivs does anything for our brute force noise. As you can see, with the higher max subdivs, we have a little bit of a change, but we have a ridiculously low threshold and a fairly good max subdivs. But really, the GI, that's the subdivs that you really want to get rid of those little tiny gold flakes that you see. So upping those subdivs rather than upping the general subdivs is pretty much where you want to be. So if we go back to where we were, we'll notice a better improvement because of our brute force subdivs when we go to render this patch. Now, with our 32 subdivs for brute force, we're getting a much cleaner result without having to resort to a very low threshold and a very high max subdivs. This helped a little bit, but it's important to take a look at what's causing your noise. So this is a GI, a brute force subdivs, that's lower. I believe this was 16, and this is at 32. So there's quite a bit of difference. If I turn on my color corrections and get my level curves in there, you'll see that even more as we go down. So here's where we started with the brute force noise. It's quite this bad, and then going to 32 makes it much nicer. Okay, let's take a look at brute force primary with a light cache on the secondary. Notice that the secondary does not have a radiance map. Radiance map is only a primary bounce engine. With the light cache, we've got subdivs and sample size are the two main noise controllers. Subdivs being the number of rays basically cast in the scene, and then sample size is the size of those blotches and how well they can merge together. The lower the sample size, the more finer detail you'll have in your light cache, but the higher number of subdivs you need to cast into the scene. So before we had our brute force at 32 to get that sort of cleaner area. So we'll leave it brute force at 32 for the subdivs, and we'll leave it at 500 and 0.02 for our light cache at its default, and take a look at rendering the whole frame. There is no prepass for the brute force, however, there is a prepass for the light cache while it refines and builds itself on. Anyway, we've got one bucket left. I'm just going to go ahead and escape out of that. We've got a pretty long render time for a full HD with a brute force as the primary with 32, it really takes a lot of time in the glass, the refractions, especially at 32. You're paying a pretty high price for that primary being brute force. So it may be best to go to an irradiance map for the primary, because at 25 minutes with one bucket left, it's a pretty high price. But nonetheless, let's take a look at our irradiance map render, where this is the irradiance map, and this is our primary brute force light cache. See the light contribution on the wall is much more direct, much nicer than with our irradiance map. Controlling noise, there's not a whole lot of noise that we can see here, so it's a very clean render, including the brute force. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce my subdivisions by quite a lot. I'm going to go to a very low number at 50, and we'll take a look at doing a section here with this low subdivs so we can see what the light cache noise looks like. You'll see it didn't do very much of a prepass calculation at all. Now as this section resolves itself, we can tell that, there's not a whole lot of difference. I don't see a whole lot of noise coming up from the light cache. Why is that? Well, the simple answer is this light, this yellow light from the lamp, it's a primary bounce. So we're not going to see noise because it's in the brute force. So let's go ahead and escape this render. What we'll do is we'll do a light cache for the primary, and then we'll go brute force on the secondary. I'll reduce my brute force because we don't need 32 subdivisions on the secondary bounces. Go ahead and render this section out, and we'll see what the low subdivs will do for our render. And as you can see, it's kind of terrible. Let's go back up to 500 and take another quick render of that section. See, 500 subdivs should resolve itself fairly quickly, but still quite blotchy. You can see these blotches. When you compare them to the blotches from the irradiance map, quite a bit of a difference here. So, with the light caches our primary, we're going to need more information here. So I'm going to increase my subdivs to, let's go to 1,000 to see what difference we're going to have in the wall. And we can see it's a little bit cleaner, but you can still see the cells or the blotches. If I turn on my curve from before, it really sticks out a lot more. Now, this isn't just because of subdivs, it's also because of our sample size. And in the advanced light cache, there's a few other things that you can do. For example, we could pre-filter. And what the pre-filter will do, let's make sure this is in our buffer. So we have cleaner with more samples. Now with a pre-filter, it should blur some of these samples together to give us a bit of a cleaner result. Although it will come at the expense of fine detail. So the fine detail in some of these areas will kind of get lost with that, but you can see how that is blurred together to give you a cleaner result than without the filter. But it does get a little blurry. So if you have a lot of crevices, like this sort of area, you're kind of going to be out of luck with how that looks. Let's see what our box looks like with the primary as our light cache. And it's looking pretty good. Now this, of course, we have quite a lot of subdivs. If we go back down to our really low subdivs, let's put this in our buffer, take a look at 50 subdiv. You may not see a difference right away between frames. Matter of fact, we'll go ahead and compare. you can see some difference. What will end up being the biggest difference is when you render a sequence of frames, where you'll notice flickering, especially in small detailed areas. For these detailed areas, you want a smaller sample size and a larger subdiv size. Now let's take a look at a very different scene here. Kind of set up to take a look at some of the detail. You want your subdivisions, your splotches from any of the irradiance map or light caching to be able to fill in these cracks. So this will show up some nice detail and also color contributions, as well as our reflective and refractive caustics for GI. This has been rendered with these settings, as you can see here: radiance map, brute force, a high preset with a brute force of 8. We'll take a look at comparing the other engines. Next, we'll do brute force, brute force. Now, with a brute force primary, we're getting a lot of these familiar little dots. So we desperately would need a higher subdivision to get rid of this noise. So we compare the two different engines. We have a 30-second render for the irradiance map brute force setup, and we have a slightly longer 38-second, but much more noisier when we make our primary as the brute force. Overall lighting looks about the same, but let's go ahead and get a nicer level of subdivs from the brute force and see what that looks like compared to the irradiance map, which already looks pretty clean. And even with a subdiv of 34, we can see brute force is still pretty noisy in that primary bounce area. It does give you a little bit of a cleaner, and like I said before, a more accurate lighting response, but we're going to be waiting quite a bit longer for this render. And here we see the completed render between the two subdivs of 8 and subdivs of 32. There's definitely a much better view, but we went from a 40-second or 38-second render to a 4-minute render. That's quite a lot. Based on the irradiance map that we saw before, there's really no comparison. The only things that we see as far as the accuracy is there's a little bit more illumination happening in these detailed areas. So again, brute force is the most detailed, but certainly takes the longest to render. The caustic effects are pretty much the same as the light cache version. There's a little bit of blotchiness with the light cache, but again, 4 minutes to 30-second, that's a really big difference, and we're not even all the way there yet with the 32 subdivs. Now let's see what it looks like with a light cache as our primary. We'll set our brute force subdivs back to 8. Again, since it's a secondary bounce on the brute force, we'll notice that all this kind of noise will disappear because the light cache will be picking up that slack. Now here immediately you can see it's really bad. You can see that my detailed areas are quite pronounced in being without detail. You can see how the sample size is just not enough to get in there and get that sort of detail, plus the amount of blotchiness. We really have to reduce our sample size by quite a bit. I'm going to go to 0.005. We'll take another look at this with the new sample size. A little bit better, but still quite poor as our light cache for our primary. we really need a much smaller sample size. I'm going to go to 0.001. And of course, that's going to mean I'm going to lead a lot more in subdivisions. So I'll go to 1500 on subdivisions, a super small sample size. And we're starting to get a little bit of detail in our steps here, but it looks like a disco ball just exploded in here. Now, the render time for this is 30 seconds compared to the 30 seconds of the irradiance map, and you can definitely tell that the irradiance map is doing a much, much nicer job as the primary engine. For this to work as a good primary for light cache, we need far too many subdivs. Let's go ahead and see if we can take these subdivs and pre-filter them together to see if this cleans up at all with just the pre-filter turned on. So our pre-filter has done a little bit of a nicer job. See how it's blurring these together, but it's still woefully short in the number of subdivs that we need. So for something like this, with this kind of detail, light cache is probably not the best engine to use for the primary bounce. My favorite, as I've mentioned before, is using brute force for the primary and using light cache as the secondary. So my sample size, let's go set this back to 0.02 and our subdivs at 500 and our brute force. And here we see our render with a brute force primary. We've got some grain issues, especially because this is a primary. We're definitely going to need to bring up our subdivs for the brute force. And let's take another quick look at that with higher subdivs. We'll do a quick render. We can already see that the subdivs going up to 32 from 8 has done quite a lot to help this area. And this render at 32 subdivs, when we compare it to the 8 subdivs, will make a very, very big difference. A lot of those errant little bright spots are gone. You still have a little bit of noise, but you've got some pretty decent illumination, some pretty decent clarity. Some noise still with higher subdivs will help out. This was a 1 minute versus a 21 second. So a little bit extra time, but much better quality with the brute force as the primary. Now let's go back to having our irradiance map as our primary. And we'll keep the light cache as our secondary. Let's render this and compare it to the brute force primary that we just did. And our render is pretty nice, pretty clean. If we want to really take a look, we're going to lose a little bit of detail. The irradiance map, especially in this corner here, where the red wall meets these white steps, there's a loss of illumination. The brute force gives us that illumination because, again, brute force is the most accurate of the engines. So we're losing some detail over here, but we're also losing some of that noise that we had. And in a 22-second render versus a 1 minute render, we're cleaner. We have a much faster render as well. But again, we're losing some of that detail. Now, in a radiance map, which is our primary right now, there's a checkbox called Enhanced Details. We'll take a look at comparing this render with one where we've turned on Enhanced Details. Give us more of this detail here in this area compared to before. We've gotten some of that illumination back with the enhanced details. Our render times went up to about 47 seconds from 19, but it's definitely much nicer. It's also trying to enhance the detail of our caustic area, and it's actually made it a little bit noisier, but it is more detail. We have more illumination from there, and with enhanced detail, it's a slight render hit, but you're going to be playing with the detail radius and your subdiv's multiplier to get some of this noise out. Go ahead and load up the scene, giscenesengines.ma, and play around with your own combination of primary and secondary bounces. It'll give you a pretty good idea of where you can go, what you've got to do, and how much render time to quality you're going to get from it. But by and large, you have to kind of go in and feel around a little bit to see which engines work best for your scene and for your tolerance of noise. And also, when you start animating, what I find is that a radiance map with a brute force secondary or a brute force primary with a light cache secondary works pretty well, but it really depends on the amount of motion that you've got. And here we are in 3D Studio Max. This is the scene we ended up with. Here's our render with GI turned on, with a radiance map brute force at their default settings. So what we're going to do is we're going to be importing the low-res candles like we did with the Maya side. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything in these candle groups. I'm just going to hide them for now, get them out of the way. So for Max, that means merge. So we go to import, we go to merge, and in last week's files, week 03 files Max version, there is a file called candles import lowpoly.max. We're going to basically bring in all the objects in that scene with auto rename the names. So we've got a unique name for all these objects coming in. Now it seems like these are a little bit out of place, so let's go ahead and select them and move them into place. Now we've got these in place. What we want to do is assign the materials over. So let's get the slate open, or the compact if that's the one that you prefer. And we have our materials here pretty much. And you just want to go ahead and attach them to the new material. So here's all the glass, and here's our material, candle glass. Our materials. Now we have to do our wax. Oops. That would be candle, candle, and candle. Naming our materials is super duper helpful, as is having a good name for the actual objects. Our wicks will go to our wick shader. And our plastic stopper is last but not least. Okay, so now our low-res geometry have all the shaders that we need, and we can go ahead and render. Let's get this into the history buffer so we can compare. Now our candles are going to be in a slightly different positioning, but yeah, that's just something we'll have to deal with. Go ahead and render this part out and see what the low-res candles look like in 3D Max. And here we are. We're losing a little bit of detail in the glass, but we knew that to begin with. Now, the interpenetration issue is not so much apparent here, but still what we want to do is add the subdivision that we did in Maya earlier. Now here we're zoomed in on one of our candles, and this is a render of the low-res candle. Like we saw a little bit earlier, it's pretty clean. There's a little bit of an interpenetration issue between the wax and the glass. Not as pronounced as it was in the Maya render, but still we're going to want to add a subdivision to it at render time. And with Maya, it was merely adding the subdivision and subdivision quality attribute to the shape node of the object. But in 3ds Max, you're going to add it as a modifier. And it's the same vray displacement modifier that we've used before in the class we had on displacements. So in this modifier, I need to change the type to subdivision. And here in the amount, just to make sure that this doesn't start bulging out or displacing, I'm going to change the amount to 0. We've got edge length and max subdivs, something that we saw before when we looked at this modifier. Edge length will pretty much do nothing for us because we're not displacing, but max subdivision certainly will. So we're going to set it at 4, which is the default in Maya when you add that attribute. Comes in with a max subdivs of 4. 256 is pretty high. We just want to take a little bit of the edge off, especially with this one, seeing as it's a lot more clean. We'll go ahead and render. We'll see what the glass starts looking like. And here we have a render that's been subdivided a little bit more with a max of 4. We see a little bit more definition, a little bit more rounding off of the geometry, and a little more thickness to the glass, a little more clarity, and some of that interpenetration has certainly disappeared. Now, the cool thing about adding this as a modifier is that I can select all the pieces of my scene together in one shot, and then go into modifiers and add my displacement mod. Each one will pick up the last settings that you had set up. So subdivision's already turned on, my amount is at 0, and my max subdivs is at 4. So all of my modifiers have the same settings already, which is great. So all we really need to do is take our original candles, the high-res candles that we've got here, and delete them out of our scene. Simple as that. Boom. And save our scene. And we now have low-res candles with subdivision at render time, making them look a little bit more like the original glass that we had, although some of that tessellation detail that we had in the original geometry is missing, and there's really no way to get it back unless you're actually using the high-res geometry. Now, we're going to compare the GI engines like we did with Maya, but pretty much the parameters and attributes are pretty similar, so there's not a whole lot that we can do here in Max that's different than what we did in Maya. But you've got a folder available this week called Week 4 Files, Max version, and in there is a scene called GI Scenes Engines.max. And in here, this is the same setup as we had basically before with the little glass cylinder there as well. So you can do some comparisons yourself with the engines. You can certainly follow along what we were talking about in the My section of things. We've got radiance map, brute force setup. If any of the parameters may be missing from what we're talking about in the Maya part of the video, remember you've got advanced and expert settings here to bring up those parameters if they look like they're missing. So we started with radiance map, brute force. We went to light cache, brute force. We went to brute force, brute force. All of those are the same. The caustic settings are a little bit different than they are shown in Maya. For example, if we go to our radiance map brute force, caustics is a simple on-off, basic and advanced. So let's try a render of the scene with caustics turned off. We'll be looking primarily at our glass cylinder here. We've got a radiance map and brute force. Let's see what our render looks like. And here we have some caustic. Now our light is basically back here. So this is a refractive caustic that's already on. Now, turning on caustics here and rendering the scene again, we're going to see a slight difference. Now I've already rendered it. Take a look. You can see we've got a reflective caustic going on right at the bottom. So we've got a better contribution of that caustic coming in. Now your caustic will be slightly different depending on which primary engine that you use. But if you follow along the Maya portion of the video with this scene, you can get to see the different ways of mitigating the noise. The parameters are still pretty much the same. We've got the current preset, subdivs, interpolation samples. If we go to brute force, it's all about the subdivs. If we go to a light cache, same thing as we had in Maya. It's about the subdivs and the sample size. Well, have fun. Tool around with the scene a little bit. Do a couple of tests to see what the different engines do for you time-wise. Of course, keep in mind you can put in the timestamp by turning this on and making sure that render time is in here. You can do that with the little percent sign. You can add the render time to it quite easily. So that's it. Have fun. We'll see you next week and see you on the forums if you have any questions.